Other senators who wish to vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 78, the nays are 18. The motion to instruct the Sergeant at Arms is agreed to, and a quorum is present.
Mr. President.
The majority, the senator from Washington State, senior senator from Washington State.
Mr. President, the Senate is not in order.
The senator is correct. The Senate is not in order. The Senate will be in order. The senator deserves to be heard. The senator will withhold just a moment. The conversations could.
Mr. President.
The senator from Washington State.
Mr. President, when a house is on fire, the reasonable thing to do is put it out and then figure out what happened so you can prevent the next one. When a ship is headed towards rocks, the reasonable thing to do is to steer away and then work on charting a better course. When a government is shut down and is headed towards a default that economists would say is catastrophic, the reasonable thing to do is end the crisis, steer away from the next one, and work together on a long-term plan to avoid these crises in the future. Mr. President, Madam President, we are now in the second week of this absolutely unnecessary government shutdown.
The Senate is not in order. We have colleagues conversation.
The Senate will be in order. Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Madam President. You know, every day we are hearing more and more about the tremendous impact that this is having on our families and our communities across the country, and it is only going to get worse. But, Madam President, we can end this today. It does not have to continue. We are holding the door open for our Republican colleagues to join us in putting a stop to this madness. All they need to do is come in. Madam President, Senate Democrats have spent the last 6 months trying to get Republicans to join us at the table in a budget conference. We knew there were two options: conference or crisis. Working together towards a bipartisan budget deal or lurching separately into a completely avoidable government shutdown. Now, a number of Republicans have joined us in a push for negotiations, but no matter how many times we tried, we were blocked. We were pushed to this point by a refusal to negotiate. And now the only path forward is for the House to end the crisis and then join us at the table that we have been waiting to sit at for 6 months. Because, Madam President, Democrats want to negotiate. We want to have a conversation. We think the only way out of this cycle of constant crisis is for the two sides to work together, to make some compromises, and get to a fair and responsible long-term deal. But it just does not make sense to do that while our families and our communities are being hurt by this government shutdown and while the threat of a default hangs over their head. Madam President, I served on the Super Committee. I worked with my colleagues to write and pass our budget here in the Senate. I know Democrats and Republicans have some serious differences when it comes to our budget values and our priorities. And I absolutely believe we owe it to the American people to try to bridge that divide, to find common ground. But are we really going to ask them to wait patiently, continue suffering through this shutdown, keep watching as we cruise towards an economic calamity while another super committee gets together and has a conversation? Madam President, that does not make sense. Let's have those conversations. Let's have those negotiations. But let's end this crisis and get to work. Now, yesterday I heard something from the Speaker. He said he didn't want to end the shutdown or address the debt limit now because that would be, quote, unconditional surrender to the President. Madam President, have we really come to the point where simply allowing the government to open is considered by one party to be a political loss? Are we really in a place where the majority of one chamber in one branch of government believes allowing the United States of America to pay its bills is a major concession? I say to my Republican friends who are here today, can you imagine if our roles were reversed? Now, for example, I've been working very hard this year to write an early childhood education bill I'm passionate about, that I believe will really help our children and our families. Now, I suspect there are a few people in this chamber today, including several on the Republican side, who could one day see themselves in the White House. If that day were to come, what would my Republican colleagues do if I said to them that if they did not pass my bill to expand pre-K, I would get all the Democrats together and we would refuse to pass any spending bills until we got what we wanted? And if that led to a government shutdown because they refused to let my bill pass, what would they do if I demanded a super committee to discuss ways to invest in our children before I allowed a vote to open the government back up again? I would humbly suggest that my Republican colleagues would say exactly what Democrats are saying now. This is not a legitimate way to negotiate, and the only path forward is to end this crisis and then have a conversation. Madam President, the great American system that we hold so dear, our democracy that is the envy of the world, simply cannot work if a minority of members can threaten to shut down the government or devastate the economy if they don't get their way on an issue, any issue. That is not what Democrats did when we were in the minority, and it is not what we should do should that day come again. Our system was designed to push both sides towards negotiations in a divided government, to encourage negotiation and movements towards common ground. It breaks down when one side refuses to negotiate in advance of a crisis, and it falls apart when a minority refuses to allow the basic functions of our government to perform unless their demands are met. Madam President, I know all of my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, came here to fight for their constituents, to solve problems, to make this country work better. I know there is nobody here today, not a single senator, who was sent here to shut the government down or to push this country towards an unprecedented default on our loans. And I know so many of my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, are sick of the constant crises. They hate seeing their constituents get hurt. As my friend, the senator from Arizona, said yesterday, I think we should find a way to sit down and find a way out of these dead ends. Madam President, that is what I am here today to offer: a way out, a path forward. It is not a defeat of one side or the other. It is certainly not any kind of surrender, but it would allow us to get out of this mess that has been created and open up a path to negotiations so we can avoid the next one. I am going to ask for consent, once again, to start a budget conference as soon as the current crisis is ended. Democrats have made it clear we want to negotiate. We couldn't have made it clearer. We will sit down and negotiate over anything the Republicans want, and we pledge to work as hard as we can for as long as it takes until we get a fair long-term budget deal to end these constant crises. But first, this current crisis needs to end, and the threat of the next one needs to be lifted. Madam President, Republicans don't need a hostage. There are plenty of things Democrats want out of a long-term deal that we are very interested in making some compromises for. So I urge my Republican colleagues to please consider today taking us up on this offer. We can end this today. We can do the right thing for our families and the communities that we represent. And we can get back to work helping people, solving problems, and working together. So, Madam President, I respectfully ask unanimous consent that when the Senate receives a message from the House that they have receded from their amendment and concurred in the amendment of the Senate with respect to H.J. Res. 59, the Senate then proceed to the consideration of calendar number 33, H. Con. Res. 25, that the amendment at the desk, which is the text of S. Con. Res. 8, the budget resolution passed by the Senate, be inserted in lieu thereof, that H. Con. Res. 25 as amended be agreed to, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, that the Senate proceed to a vote on a motion to insist on its amendment, request a conference with the House on the disagreeing votes of those two houses, and authorize the chair to appoint conferees on the part of the Senate, with all of the above occurring with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Madam President.
The Republican whip.
Madam President, reserving the right to object. On this side of the aisle, we agree it's good to negotiate, and we should. I would only hope that the President of the United States would be a part of that negotiation in order to make it successful. But I would ask my friend, why is the request contingent on passage of the House continuing resolution? The Democrats have already rejected the House request to go to conference on the CR, seemingly in contrast to what they're now asking for, which is a negotiation. Hopefully, we'll pass H.R. 3273, the Deficit Reduction and Economic Growth Working Group Act, which will create a bicameral, bipartisan group to address the CR and the debt limit situation. But on the Republican side, again, I would say to our friends, we have a long-standing request to make sure that reconciliation instructions are not in order in a budget conference so that the debt limit can be increased on a strictly party line vote. We happen to think it's a problem when, if the debt ceiling were raised, as the Democrats are requesting, we'd see the debt go up by 68% under this president, more than all other presidents in American history who preceded him. We think that's a bad idea. So, Madam President, I would ask the distinguished senator from Washington whether she would consider an amended unanimous consent request, and we'd ask that the Senate, by way of amendment, that the Senate proceed to the consideration of calendar 33, H. Con. Res. 25, that the amendment at the desk, which is the text of S. Con. Res. 8 and the budget resolution passed by the Senate, be inserted in lieu thereof, that H. Con. Res. 25 be amended, be agreed to, the motion to reconsider being considered made and laid upon the table, that the Senate proceed to a vote on a motion to insist on its amendment, request a conference of the House on the disagreeing votes of the two houses, and authorize the chair to appoint conferees on the part of the Senate, with all the above occurring with no intervening action or debate. I'd further ask consent that it not be in order for the Senate to consider a conference report that includes reconciliation instructions to raise the debt limit.
Madam President.
Will the senator so modify her request?
Madam President, reserving the right to object, let me make one observation. That sometimes I think that those who have been objecting now 21 times to our request to go to conference have forgotten who I will be conferencing with, which is the Republican House majority. What they fight so adamantly and strongly for here on the Senate will be well, I believe, ably represented in a conference committee. That's the point of a conference committee. That's what our democracy was set up to do, in a divided government where we had the opportunity to do that. So, Madam President, having a conference committee to work out our budget agreements is exactly what I've asked for. But I will object because what the senator's request does is simply say we're going to keep our government closed. We're not going to allow people to do the functions that are so desperately needed. We're going to stay closed. We're going to hold that hostage. And, Madam President, as I said so clearly when I spoke before, we need to open the government, we need to pay our bills, and we need to negotiate. That's what our request does. That's what the Republican request does not do, and I object.
Objection is heard to the modified.
Madam President, I object.
Is there objection to the original unanimous consent
I
request?
object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President,
The Assistant Majority Leader.
Madam President, I want to thank the senator from Washington for the 21st time coming to the floor of the United States Senate and asking the Republicans to join us in a conference committee to resolve our budget differences between the House and the Senate. 21 times Senator Murray has come to this floor simply asking to negotiate. And the Republicans, who have been arguing that we don't negotiate, turned her down 21 times, the latest by the senior senator from Texas. The junior senator from Texas shut down the government over the notion of defunding Obamacare. Now the senior senator from Texas has said he objects to going to a conference committee to resolve our differences, Republicans and Democrats, between the House and the Senate. If we are going to restore this Senate to the orderly process, what the senator from Washington has asked for is very basic. Open the government. This morning, the chaplain of the Senate started by acknowledging the 5 families who were notified after they had lost a military member, a son, a husband, a brother in Afghanistan over the weekend. And the chaplain noted that in their bereavement, they were being denied the basic benefits which this government gives to these grieving families after they've lost someone in uniform. The chaplain of the Senate said it this morning: enough is enough. This notion that closing down our government and keeping it closed is somehow acceptable political conduct is outrageous. We just left the press conference where Senator Mikulski of Maryland, Senator Cardin, Senator Kaine, Senator Warner of Virginia spoke about the impact on the local economy of the loss of these jobs from the government shutdown. I could tell stories of Illinois where 50,000 federal workers have either been furloughed or their checks are being withheld for the most part. And this is unnecessary and it's unacceptable. We were in the midst of a terrible accident last week, right before October 1st. A train ran into one of our metro trains coming back from the airport. 30 people were sent to the hospital. The National Transportation Safety Board went out to investigate the accident to find out what led to this terrible thing. They had to leave at midnight on October 1st after having collected what evidence they could because the government was shut down. The investigation was suspended. That is one small example. The 5 families grieving. It goes on and on. And what we hear from the Republicans is we'll take care of each of these as it arises. We'll pick out the vital functions of government. So far, all of the bills passed by the House of Representatives represent only 18% of the domestic discretionary budget of the United States. All of the bills combined. So each day, as another tragedy occurs, as another embarrassment to this Republican strategy emerges, they'll try to find a way to fix that story, fix that problem. It's time for us to fix our sights on a solution that is befitting the great nation of America. Open the government, pay our bills while we negotiate. That is the only responsible way to approach it. I am sorry that for the 21st time, the Republicans have come to the floor and denied the request by the Senate Budget Committee Chair, Senator Murray of Washington, to sit down and negotiate. 21 times the Republicans have refused to allow us to enter into a bipartisan negotiation. That's why we face the problems that we do today. I yield the floor.
The senator from Alabama.
Madam President, it is a good thing that the Democrats, for the first time after 4 years, passed a budget, at least brought one to the floor and passed it on a strictly partisan basis. But before that, they not only didn't pass one, they didn't bring one to the floor for 4 years and refused to do so even though a specific provision of the United States Code called on them to do so, actually required them to do so. It was a stunning development. Senator Conrad, then Democratic chair of the Budget Committee, wanted to bring budgets up, fought to bring budgets up. One time said he was going to bring the budget up, but Senator Durbin and others and the leadership apparently had a vote, and they voted against him. Senator Murray, to her credit, has gotten a budget through, and the presiding officer is a member of that committee, and they got a budget through this year, which was a good thing. But I'm not sure, but I suspect Senator Murray was one of those that blocked Senator Conrad from even bringing a budget up for 4 years. So I don't know. I think it's a bit aggressive to say that Republicans are blocking a budget when the history is they haven't even voted on one. But secondly, on that point, there are members on this side of the aisle that simply say that the legislation necessary to raise the debt ceiling again should be passed like legislation should be passed on the floor of the Senate, and it would require a 60-vote point of order. You have to have 60 votes to pass. And their concern is that in conference, a raising of the debt ceiling would be put on the budget, which only requires 51 votes for passage. And they have simply said they would allow the budget to go to conference, they would agree to conference, but they want a commitment from my Democratic colleagues. They won't try to sneak through raising the debt ceiling on the budget, which doesn't require but 51 votes. And our colleagues have flatly refused to do that agreement. If they would make that agreement, we would go to conference. That's clear on the budget, and I think that our Democratic majority should agree to that. They've indicated they don't intend to put that on the budget. One time Senator Durbin said he didn't think it was appropriate to put it on the budget. Well, if so, let's make clear we're not going to gimmick it up and add that to it. We are, and the reason we've had such contention at this point in history is that we're facing fundamental challenges relevant to the whole future of America financially. It's a time of great importance. The American people understand it. The American people want us to take action to place this country on a sound financial path. And so we're heading to the debt ceiling. And we, by law, limit the amount of money Congress can borrow, how much money we can spend above our current, how much we can borrow. We're now spending about $3,500 billion a year, and we're taking in about $2,800 billion a year. Think about that. That's what we're doing every year, and it's unsustainable. August of 2011, we faced the debt ceiling, and the American people told Congress, you guys, we want to clip back on your credit card. You're not going to continue to borrow this much money every year. We want you, before you raise the debt ceiling, we want you to show that you're going to be more frugal, that you're going to manage our money better. And the Republicans dug their heels in on that and said, Mr. President, we're not going to raise the debt ceiling until you agree to some financial constraints, that you're not going to keep spending recklessly every year. And after a tense time, there was an agreement reached, and a committee was formed, an agreement was reached, and this is what we agreed to, that over the next 10 years, first, we would raise the debt ceiling $2.1 trillion. And then we agreed over the next 10 years that we would reduce the projected growth of spending by $2.1 trillion. One for one, as Speaker Boehner said. So he gave the Congress 10 years to find the cuts, but we've already now, in a little over 2 years, borrowed another $2 trillion, and we hit the debt ceiling cap again. And we have not yet come close to saving the $2 trillion that we promised to save. And by the way, these are not really cuts. Overall, when you look at the United States budget, The United States budget was projected to increase spending from $37 trillion over 10 years to $47 trillion over 10 years. With the Budget Control Act, spending would increase from $37 trillion to $45 trillion over 10 years. That's not really a cut in spending, is it? Yes, the way it's been carried out hits some departments more than others, particularly the Defense Department, and we need to adjust that. But fundamentally, the reduction in the growth of spending that was part of the BCA last year was not extreme, not irresponsible, and should be preserved and must be preserved. But colleagues, President of the United States, after signing that agreement in August, and the sequester is all part of the BCA, it was all part of the same deal that created the $2.1 trillion in savings. In January, after that August, he proposed a budget that would increase spending another $1 trillion and would raise taxes $1 trillion. And that's basically what our colleagues passed in their budget this year. Spend $1 trillion more than the Budget Control Act says we should spend, and raise taxes another $1 trillion over 10 years. This is a total abdication of the promise we made to the American people. We said, American people, okay, we're going to vote to raise the debt ceiling. A lot of people didn't like any raising of the debt ceiling. I got to tell you, phone calls in my office were against it. Any raising of it. They said it's time for you guys to live within your means like I have to do in my house. So we raised it, but we promised, did we not? We promised we wouldn't spend so much. We promised that we would reduce spending $2.1 trillion, but over 10 years. And a lot of cynics around here, you know what they said? They said Congress won't adhere to that. That's just a bunch of baloney. They promise that all the time, and then they breach their promises all the time. That's why the country is going broke. That's exactly what the President did in January of 2012, 6 months after the thing was agreed to. He proposed to spend another $1 trillion above the amount of money we agreed to spend 6 months before. Oh, why? Well, I didn't really want to sign that agreement. I didn't really want to spend that much money, cut that much money. So I'm not bound by it. I didn't make a promise to the American people. I forgot all about that. That was 6 months ago. Oh, a 10-year promise that we're going to contain the growth of spending for 10 years? Forget that. I don't want to do that. I want to spend more. I've got investments I want to make. I got taxes I want to increase. This is fundamentally what's occurring here. So we have got to stand firm and adhere at least to the containment of the growth in spending that was in the Budget Control Act. We have to. A failure to do that is a capitulation in our promises to the American people, a total abandonment of any pretension that we will be fiscally responsible in this body. It is just unthinkable that we would abandon the limits that we had in the Budget Control Act. And the truth is, the sad truth is, the Budget Control Act reductions in the growth of spending do not come close to putting us on a firm financial footing. We are still on an unsustainable debt course, as our Congressional Budget Office has told us. Yes, we've seen a reduction in the deficits this year, $600 billion. People say that's great. George Bush has been called profligate, and sometimes he was. The highest deficit he ever had was $470 billion. His last year in office, the year before his last year in office, it was $167. President Obama has averaged, in his 6 years, will have averaged almost $1 trillion a year, 1,000 billion in deficits. We've never, ever come close to that kind of deficits before in the history of the Republic. So what does a budget say that says we want to tax people $1 trillion more and spend more money and under these circumstances? I'll tell you what it says. American people need to pay attention to this. What it says is, from the President, from our majority here in the Senate, it says, it's not our problem. We can't find any more ways to reduce the growth of spending. We can't save another dime, you people. You just don't understand. There's no way we can save any more money. We got a problem, though, and you know who's responsible for it? You are. You, the American people. It's your fault. You won't give us enough money. If you would just send more money, another $1 trillion, another $2 trillion, another $600 billion that was passed in January, just another few $100 billion more, $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there in taxes, why, we could solve all our problems. Send us more money. And by the way, we'll use that money to create government programs, government bureaucracies that impose great cost on the American economy and have, in fact, resulted in the declining wages of American workers to a degree that's not acceptable. We need a growth-oriented, lean government, a lean government that serves the people for the least possible cost and reduces these deficits. And deficits themselves are pulling the economic growth in our country down. The size of our debt is so large, we've never had anything like it, that it's already beginning to diminish the prospects for growth in our economy and reduce job creation and reduce wages. So, Madam President, I know that we're in a tough time now. We certainly need to work our way out of this. But the President negotiated over the debt ceiling August of 2011, and we made at least a step forward. In fact, it was the most significant fiscal step this country has taken maybe in decades. And for the last 2 years, we've actually spent less money than the year before. Think about that. Well, to hear people talk, they think the country was going to collapse. But we've had a modest reduction in spending, and that's been good. It's been good, and but it's not near enough to put us on a sustained path. So we need to save Social Security. We need to strengthen and save Medicare. We cannot afford the Affordable Care Act. We've got a total misrepresentation on the Affordable Care Act with regard to its cost. The Governmental Accounting Office, our independent auditor, has told us it's going to add $6 trillion to the debt of the United States over the long term. It doesn't pay for itself, nowhere close. It's as unstable financially as Social Security is.
The Senator's time has expired.
I thank the Chair, and will just say, colleagues, let's keep working. Maybe we can develop some ways that confront our financial problems. It's absolutely critical that we do. We have a moral responsibility to do that, and we've got to start working together to achieve it. I think the President needs to back off his statements that he will not negotiate on the continuing resolution or the debt ceiling. I would yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Senator from Oregon.
Madam President, I'd ask my colleague from Alabama if he has a moment or two more after I read an official consent request, if he might stay for a moment for a question about how that Budget Conference Committee works. Thank you very much. Madam President, I have one unanimous consent request for a committee to meet during today's session of the Senate. It has the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that this request be agreed to and that this request be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. And through the Chair, I wanted to pose a question about the Budget Conference Committee because I think it's something that has puzzled a lot of people across America. We hear some folks standing up and giving speeches saying, for 6 months we've been trying to get a conference committee, and we have other folks who are standing up and saying, well, we'd be glad to go to conference as long as there's a deal beforehand on exactly what is done in the conference committee. And in that regard, I thought it would be useful to have kind of a little bit of a perspective here. And my understanding is that anything that comes out of the Budget Conference Committee would have to have agreement of both the team of delegates from the House side and the team of delegates from the Senate side. This is a question I would ask of the ranking member of the Budget Committee to clarify that process.
Madam President,
The senator from Alabama.
I thank the senator, and of course that's correct. I understand that the Speaker has indicated that there's no guarantee that the increase in debt ceiling would not be a part of a conference report that came out of conference committee, and we have independent senators in this body that simply said we don't think we should be subjected to having the debt ceiling increase without a full debate and the normal processes of 60 votes in the Senate. So that's where the disagreement lies, and people can have disagreements about the validity of their concern, but it's a legitimate concern, and if there's no intention to move a budget through a 50-vote, move a debt ceiling increase without at 51 votes, and why wouldn't my colleagues agree not to do it? So that's the disagreement, I think, that now exists.
Thank you, Madam President.
The senator from Oregon.
I might ask a couple other pieces of this puzzle. Why not, with that concern, I would pass this question through the chair to my colleague, why not, with that concern, simply ask the House delegates to carry that concern rather than blocking the start of the conference committee?
Madam President,
Senator from Alabama.
My colleague through the chair. Well, it's very simple. Senators have rights, and they have a right to assert those privileges on the floor of the Senate. And we have senators that say you shouldn't do this on, you shouldn't raise the debt ceiling on the budget bill, and we don't want to go to conference unless you do. Agree not to sneak that through without a full debate and vote on the floor of the Senate. And attaching it to a bill is a budget deal that's huge and would have a lot of interest in it, would make it even more difficult to separate that question out. So rightly or wrongly, that's their view. And I just would say I don't see any problem, and I'm amazed at the intransigence of the majority and not just accepting that. Because I don't think it's likely, as you indicated, the House would add that to it, frankly. Not too worried about it, but some are, and that's causing the disagreement right now. I think it'd be great to go to conference and would like to see a conference occur, frankly. I think it's an unusual and positive development that after 4 years of not even bringing a budget to the floor, that we now have the majority here passing a budget, so we could try to do something with it in conference. Although I got to tell you, all of our colleagues, there's a big difference in the budget, because the budget passed out of the Senate with our majority that every Republican opposed completely busted the Budget Control Act. It is nowhere close to what was agreed to in that act just 2 years ago. So I think that we've got a huge gap to cover in conference, not impossible, and it would probably be a healthy thing to start that process. And I wish my colleagues would relent and commit not to try to sneak the debt ceiling increase in under budget. I would thank the chair and appreciate my colleague, member of the Budget Committee, contributes ably and works hard to try to do the right thing around here. Thank you.
Madam President,
Senator from Oregon.
the thing that puzzles me, and if my colleague would still consider responding, that'd be fine, is that there is a process on this floor for giving instructions to a conference committee. And so my colleagues left the floor, but the question I would have followed up with is, given that there is a specific process in the Senate for doing budget instructions to a conference committee, why not utilize that specific process, hold a vote on the conference committee instructions, rather than blockading the conference committee from starting? I guess I'll have to rhetorically answer the question that there's really no good explanation for why not going through the normal process of proposing a budget committee instructions for our conferees. And then the question becomes, so couldn't we resolve this today? Couldn't we resolve this today, have a proposal put forward to instruct the conferees, voted on the floor of this Senate, and it either passes or it doesn't? Isn't the whole budget process designed specifically to be a simple majority process under the Budget Act so that we can indeed get the job done and not be paralyzed? I think, Madam President, I believe the story, and I would have liked to have had the perspective of my colleague, but I think the story is a determination to not allow a majority determination of the budget instructions, to instead allow a minority to do so. I believe also that that is an absolutely unprecedented situation, but I wanted to clarify that and understand whether there was, in fact, precedent for this type of determination that in a simple majority budget process, a minority would blockade a budget conference. It's very strange that this should become such a central issue, but I want for Americans to understand that essentially it boils down to this. For 6 months we've been trying to start a budget conference committee, that a small group, a couple of individuals, have wanted to instruct that budget committee, but to do so without going through the normal process on the floor, and so they could do it as a minority rather than as a discussion and decision of the Senate as a whole. And it's that precedent that really seems unacceptable, and I think if the tables were turned, it would be felt strongly on the other side. I hope to keep exploring those questions because we really, this 6-month obstruction of being able to get the budget that provides the framework for spending is really deeply damaging. And this body absolutely has to be able to do its fundamental work in determining the budget, getting a budget conference, getting a budget number, doing the spending bills, called appropriation bills, because otherwise we are careening from crisis to crisis. Now, I'm going to shift gears here. I'm going to step back from what's going on immediately with the shutdown and ask, where did the seeds of this come from? And if we turn back to about April of 2009, shortly after I first came to the Senate, there was a memo put out by an individual named Frank Luntz. And Frank Luntz was providing a roadmap on how to block any sort of improvement in our health care system. Frank Luntz said, and he was specifically instructing my colleagues across the aisle, said it doesn't matter what is in the health care bill. It doesn't matter what good it does. Whatever it is, let's attack it and call it a government takeover. Now, this was long before anybody even knew what was going to be in the bill. So this strategy of poisonous partisanship rather than problem solving has been with us since at least April of 2009. And so, therefore, a series of myths were generated. And as the process proceeded, those who were behind the myths kind of doubled down on them. For example, we have, in the health care reform, a process by which small businesses can join together and get the marketing clout of a large group, negotiate lower rates, and get a better deal. But under the Frank Lutz, let's demonize and deceive strategy, instead of honoring the fact that the small businesses will be able to get a better rate, there's been an assertion this would hurt small businesses. Now, in the health care reform bill, we have a process by which individuals who had no market clout can band together and get a much better deal. And we're seeing significant drops in rates for individuals across this country under the marketplaces that are just now opening for sign-up. But indeed, under the Frank Lutz deceive and demonize strategy, it became, let's tell people insurance rates will go up instead of down. We have a bill before us, not a bill, but a health care reform law coming into effect that ends abuses in the insurance industry. The situation where you couldn't get a policy if you had a pre-existing condition. The sort of situation where if you had insurance and you got sick, you would be thrown off the policy. The fact that children weren't able to stay on your policy until they were able to get health care insurance of their own. These Bill of Rights are reforms that are deeply sought by Americans across this country, urban and rural, but under the Frank Lutz deceive and demonize strategy, there was simply an assertion, unfounded, that this would destroy the insurance system. You have a process whereby, under the marketplaces, insurance companies will have to compete, private insurance companies, and yet under the Frank Lutz strategy adopted by some of my colleagues across the aisle, they decided to say this would hurt competition, even though it strengthens competition. It puts people apple to apples having to lay out their rates and their benefits under these different levels of insurance. And we're seeing that competition from private companies proceed to lower rates. Well, so let's fast forward. We had that phase of the demonize the plan, even though we have to mischaracterize it and deceive and delude Americans about what's really in it. Then we have...
The senator's time has expired.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And I will just wrap up with a sentence or two with the cooperation of my colleagues. Thank you for coming to the floor to continue the conversation. I think it's so important that we proceed to put our government back on track and quit careening from crisis to crisis, doing damage to communities and families across our nation. Thank you, Madam President.
President.
The senator from Vermont.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the period for morning business for debate only be extended until 5 p.m. Senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each. The Majority Leader be recognized following morning business. Further, the Republican side have the time from 2 to 2:45 p.m. The Majority have the time from 2:45 to 3:30 p.m.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you. And Madam President, I think in listening to the distinguished senator from Oregon, what he said about regular order, he remembers he was here with me till 6 o'clock on a Saturday morning. Passed that budget bill. We'd gone all week long, dozens upon dozens of votes, and we passed it. Want to go to conference with the House, where there actually be a lot more Republicans sitting at the table than Democrats. And why haven't we? Because a Republican, one Republican, representing the Tea Party, stands up on this floor and objects unless it's rewritten to be exactly the way a minority of one people want it. I've been here a long time. I can't imagine any of the Republicans or Democrats that I've served with over the years, distinguished people, including one of my best friends, a distinguished Republican from the Senator State, Mark Hatfield. They would never agree to that. So I thank you for raising it. Madam President, today is day 9 of the government shutdown. if you're one of the people who have been directly affected by it, it feels a lot more than 9 days. Now, the House Republicans have piously blamed everyone except themselves, but there's no mystery about what's happening. It's very simple. They continue to refuse to permit a vote on a continuing resolution to keep the government open for one reason alone. They disagree with one law, the Affordable Care Act. They have no alternative to it. I mean, the parents who like the idea that their children can stay on their insurance while they're in college, they'd do away with that. But they have no alternative. Or the people who like the fact that if they have a pre-existing condition of cancer, heart, whatever, they can now get insurance. They would do away with that, but no alternative. We voted on this dozens of times. It was signed into law by the President. It was ruled constitutional by the Supreme Court. In the last presidential election, one candidate said, if elected, he would do away with it. The American people resoundingly opposed that. So now we have tens of millions of uninsured Americans can obtain affordable health insurance, including those with pre-existing condition. But House Republicans, a handful of Tea Party senators don't like it. They've used all kinds of scare tactics to try to derail it, but offer absolutely nothing, not one word of an alternative to help the uninsured people, help the people with pre-existing conditions, help the children who are in college. Millions of Americans know better. They've already shown they want to sign up. Tea Party members of Congress who compromised a dirty word on a crusade to hold the federal government hostage until the Affordable Care Act, which has been passed, has been the subject of a presidential election, has been upheld by the Supreme Court, is repealed because a handful of them want it repealed. Now, then, having closed the government, they got a lot of angry phone calls from outraged constituents, and so all of a sudden, oh, wait a minute, we'll pick and choose which government plan to vote. Well, the latest poll is revealing for what it says about the Tea Party Republicans. It is as though they suddenly learned for the first time the federal government is comprised of millions of hardworking Americans, Democrats and Republicans and independents in every state who perform countless tasks the rest of the country depends on. Do they not realize that many of the people who sent them to Washington depend on the federal government for their monthly paychecks for the hard work they do? That every American depends on the federal government to inspect the safety of the food they eat, the water they drink, the air they breathe. That America's students and farmers depend on loans from the federal government. Countless needy families depend on federally funded Head Start programs. That the Department of Health and Human Services pays for the vaccine to protect American children from polio, measles, and other diseases. As the Speaker say, well, he wants the President to sit down and have a conversation. Well, President Obama has shown time and time again he's willing to compromise, actually more than some of us would have liked. But he sat down with the Speaker last week. But no President, I don't care if it's Republican or Democratic, should negotiate the terms of keeping the federal government operating. And no member of Congress should recklessly toy with the United States defaulting on its debt payments for the very first time in its history, and when the world is finally recovering from a devastating global recession. The senior senator from Maryland, the chairwoman of the Appropriations Committee, has done an excellent job of explaining what is at stake, not only for American families, but for the reputation of the United States. We are, after all, the world's oldest democracy. And I think senators should be aware of the impact of the shutdown on thousands of American companies that depend on financing from the federal government to export their products and invest overseas and create jobs here. During this shutdown, the Export-Import Bank, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, cannot provide new loans or insurance to U.S. companies. This means that every month those companies lose $2 to $4 billion in revenues because of this unnecessary shutdown, and they jeopardize, just in that one area alone, 30,000 American jobs. The shutdown continues. The Department of State, which conducts all kinds of services for Americans and programs overseas, will be severely affected. You know, in fiscal year 2011, when the federal government came close to shutting down, the department estimated 70% of its Washington staff would be furloughed. And do our Tea Party friends just think that these federal workers simply sit there idly at their desk doing nothing? That there's some kind of luxury we cannot afford? Well, wait until one of their constituents is falsely arrested and imprisoned overseas, or robbed, or badly injured, or suddenly has to come back here, and there's no one there at the State Department to help them. Look at the other things we do. Almost 800,000 children under the age of 5 die every year of diarrhea, mostly due to unsafe drinking water and poor sanitation. All 800,000 of those deaths are preventable. A prolonged government shutdown, though, would mean curtailing water and sanitation programs for millions of people in the world's poorest country, programs that have always had strong bipartisan support in this body, and yet, because of the shutdown, children will die. Malaria causes 500 million deaths a year. 90% of them are children, the age of my grandchildren. A continued shutdown would force the U.S. Agency for International Development to stop funding malaria prevention programs and now put tens of thousands of lives at risk. Now, Speaker Boehner is right on one thing. He says shutting down the federal government is, quote, not a damn game, to quote him. But what the House is doing is playing Russian roulette with the U.S. economy and people's lives. There's no excuse for it. The Speaker has two choices: stop it or continue to roll the dice with the U.S. economy and the lives of millions of American families and programs that protect our nation's security. The State Department, the shutdown has already forced the cancellation of international visitors programs that enable future foreign leaders to experience this country firsthand. So instead of seeing what a great country this is, they see our political system in disarray. It's embarrassing for our country. It's embarrassing for our embassies. It's embarrassing for this senator. I believe it's embarrassing for all of us. But despite the shutdown, the State Department still has to ensure the health, safety, and welfare of nearly 10,000 academic exchange participants in the United States and abroad. Now, either those students and scholars will have to return home and thus hurt the United States, or the universities and organizations responsible for implementing the exchanges continue operating without knowing if, when, and how their costs are going to be paid. We've heard about the impact of the shutdown on the U.S. national security establishment, including the Department of Defense and our intelligence community, significant, putting America at risk every single day, escalating every single day. But the shutdown may also affect the State Department's anti-terrorism program that I would ask consent to continue for 1 minute further, and then in turn that the distinguished senator is waiting to be given an extra minute.
Without objection.
It cuts down our law enforcement border controls in countries highly vulnerable to terrorist threats: Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Kenya, Niger. It's cut down the talks between the EU and the United States on transatlantic trade and investment standards. Tea Party shutdowns prevented U.S. trade officials from traveling to Brussels to negotiate with their counterparts. President Obama had to cancel his trip to Asia this week. So the Chinese were able to fill in. Who made it to the summit? China's President Xi. He filled President Obama's seat next to Vladimir Putin. And yet we'll hear from the Tea Party. We got to do more to show our influence there. Well, it made it impossible to go. So, Madam President, I thank my distinguished colleague. I'd ask consent my full statement be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Madam President.
The senator from Kansas.
Madam President, thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here on the Senate floor this afternoon. I'm saddened by the circumstance we find ourselves in and look for solid, responsible, and quick resolution to our differences in regard to the continuing resolution. Yes, Madam President, could I ask unanimous consent that the senator from California, Senator Boxer, follow me upon the conclusion of my remarks?
Without objection.
You're very welcome. Madam President, again, the circumstances that we find ourselves in, I look forward to a quick and responsible resolution to the differences that we have and that we move forward with the funding of our federal government. I would point out that a reason that we're at this point is that we need a continuing resolution because the Senate failed to do its work in the first place. While for the first time in 4 years the Senate passed a budget, it was never reconciled in conference with the House, and I'm certainly a Republican who would be supportive of that reconciliation, a conference committee to work out the differences between a House-passed budget and a Senate-passed budget. But the reality is that there are 12 appropriation bills that, and I'm a member of the Senate Appropriations Committee. I take that responsibility very seriously. I was excited to become a member of the Senate Appropriations Committee when I arrived here in the United States Senate as an opportunity for us to establish our priorities, determine what we should be spending money on. And yet, not one of the 12 bills that are required for us to pass across the Senate floor has been passed this year, and therefore we end up on September 30th with no funding in place, and creates this opportunity for us to have this debate and discussion about a continuing resolution at a time in which there's great leverage on that issue. What I lament, what I wish would have happened is that we would have passed 12 appropriation bills and then worked out the differences with the appropriations process in the House. Today I want to speak about a particular issue related to the shutdown of the federal government, the lack of funding. Prior to that occurring, prior to September the 30th, both the House and Senate and the President signed legislation called Pay Our Military Act. It was designed to make certain that our military men and women had compensation should there be a shutdown. And I appreciate that legislation passing and am pleased that it's in place now that we are in the circumstance that we're in. There were rumors and concerns about how that bill would be implemented by the Department of Defense. The senator from West Virginia, Senator Manchin, and I led an effort in which we had 50 senators in a highly bipartisan way asked the Secretary of Defense to interpret that legislation in a broad way that would make certain that our furloughed civilian employees who support our military men and women, as well as our reserve component, those who serve in the National Guard and Reserve, would be put back to work for the benefit of the nation's security. And I want to thank the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Hagel, for his decision to implement that legislation in a broad way that did exactly that, returned furloughed civilian workers for DOD, the Department of Defense, back to work, and gave the ability for our National Guard and Reserve members to continue in their responsibilities for defending our country. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you. I'm here today to point out that we have an additional problem, in fact, one that is certainly is equally, if not more serious than that. And that is that we have read, heard that those who die in the active service of our country are not now able to receive the death benefits that come to their families upon their death. And I can't imagine that there's a senator of any political or party persuasion who thinks that's a desirable outcome. Again, with Senator Manchin and others, we worked at bringing this attention now to this issue to the attention of the Department of Defense, asking Secretary Hagel in a letter that was led by Senator Coons and Senator Blunt to use every opportunity, full authority, wide flexibility, whatever circumstances the Department of Defense could find to provide the benefits to those who died in service to our country. There's a special tax-free payment of $100,000 to eligible survivors of members of the armed forces who are killed in action. And those benefits usually arrive within the first 3 days following the death of a serviceman or woman, and those help the family certainly not overcome their loss, but to have the necessary funds for funeral services, to travel, in this case, to Dover Air Force Base, to meet their loved one as he or she returns home, to overcome the lack of a regular paycheck. This death gratuity is such a small price to pay to honor and recognize someone's family who has lost a member of their family in service to our country. And now, at least the stories are, the reports are that due to this inability for us to resolve, to work with the President, Republicans, Democrats, House, Senate, to resolve the continuing resolution, that death benefit will not be available. My understanding is the House of Representatives is poised today to pass legislation to make certain that the Department of Defense has the authority to immediately pay those benefits. I hope that's a piece of legislation that is met with unanimity of support here in the United States Senate. We've asked Secretary of Defense, Secretary Hagel, if he has the ability to do that within his current legal jurisdiction, within his the law, if he has that ability to do that within the law, that he does that. And we anxiously await and hope that the Secretary can do that. But if not, I hope that this Senate will unanimously confirm that legislation that would allow the Secretary to pay those benefits immediately. Again, no one can, I just can't imagine any of my colleagues ever thinking that under any circumstance we ought not step forward to resolve this issue. And just because we can't resolve everything, it seems to me that there's a method of operation too often here in the Senate that if we can't solve every problem, we're unwilling to solve any problem. On those things in which there's such significant agreement, we ought not let anything stand in the way of coming to the aid and rescue of a family who now so desperately grieves the loss of their loved one. We know over the weekend there were 5 soldiers killed in Afghanistan. There are 5 families as of today who would be in this circumstance. And I'd like to pay tribute to one of those 5, Sergeant Patrick Hawkins. He was born on October the 1st, 1988. He graduated from high school and enlisted in the Army in his hometown of Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And Sergeant Patrick Hawkins, according to his battalion commander, was described as a brave and incredibly talented Ranger. And the description of his death revolved around the fact that he was moving to aid another wounded Ranger when he was killed. His actions, according to, again, his commander, were in keeping with the epitome of the Ranger Creed, which is, I will never leave a fallen comrade. Sergeant Hawkins dedicated himself to serving us, to serving our families, to serving all Americans. And he ultimately paid for that service with the loss of his life. And, Madam President, I pay tribute to this soldier as an example of many who have sacrificed in similar ways over a long period of time, but especially for those 5 who this weekend lost their life in Afghanistan. Sergeant Hawkins was awarded the Bronze Star, the Meritorious Service Medal, and he was awarded a Purple Heart. None of that replaces the loss of life. He's survived by his wife, who is a resident of Kansas, of Lansing, and her parents, who are residents of my hometown of Hays, Kansas. And so, Madam President, today, on behalf of my colleagues in the United States Senate, I pay tribute to a soldier who, in serving his country, lost his life, who leaves behind grieving who leaves behind grieving family members and friends, and who once again epitomizes what we all should know in service here in the United States Senate, what I spoke about earlier on the Senate floor this week, which was, if you need a reminder about how this place should work, look to our servicemen and women who, for no partisan reason, no Republican or Democrat reason, volunteered to serve their country, but concluded that there were things that were much more important than life itself, and that being the ability to have a country that we know and enjoy as the United States of America, that has the freedoms and liberties guaranteed to us by our Constitution, and creates the opportunity for every American to pursue what we all call the American dream. Today, Madam President, I pay tribute to one more hero, one more soldier, one more American who, through service to others, was willing to sacrifice his life for the betterment of his family back home and for the future of a country that we all love and call home, the United States of America. Madam President, I yield to the senator from California.
President, would it be possible, because